This week, with the calendar winding down, the debate over Fighter of the Year is heating up. Was Terence Crawford's one big win big enough? Does Devin Haney's run through multiple weight divisions make Haney the favorite? And what about Naoya Inoue? For the second time in as many years, the monster is an undisputed champion. Will Inoue emerge as boxing's best? Greg Bishop and I break it all down this week on The Knockdown. Chris Mannix alongside Greg Bishop. And Greg, it is about that time to start talking about the Fighter of the Year. And this is the most competitive field that I can remember in years, where you have at least 3, as many as 5 legitimate candidates for Fighter of the Year. So make your case for, let's say, Terence Crawford for Fighter of the Year.
No, I like the question. I think it's totally fair, the premise. What I would argue in favor of Terence Crawford is I've never seen a performance like that in person, personally. And I'd put it above, Pacquiao Cotto, Pacquiao Hatton, some of the other fights with Floyd Mayweather, like, say, Marcus Maidana, the first one. I just thought there was a level of dominance and artistry and, like, everything that made Terence Crawford special for a long time that was done against Errol Spence on the night that they fought this summer. And I think that Terence could have helped his case by having more than one fight, but I also think that there is a case to be made for transcendence. This is a guy who was, in my opinion, somewhat unfairly maligned for his resume, a guy who's always been unique, distinct, different, and a guy who, that night, he just crushed Errol Spence in a way that left no doubt as to his brilliance. And so, if I were making the argument for him, and I actually would, that's where I'd start.
There's no question that Terence Crawford had the best win of 2023, and it's the best by a pretty significant margin. If Terence Crawford had even defended his titles against a low-level mandatory opponent, let's just say Giovanni Santillán, for example, who beat Alexis Rocha earlier in the year. If he had finished the year with a win over someone like Santillán or on that level, I think he would have sewn up the award. But even though it's not unprecedented for the Fighter of the Year to have just one fight in a year, it doesn't happen all that often. There's a reason for that. I think you have to have more than one fight to really earn that Fighter of the Year award, no matter how quality that win ultimately was. So I give him consideration, but I'm going to make my case for Devin Haney, because Devin Haney, to me, has had 2 of the best wins of 2023. He starts off the year in the spring as the undisputed champion at 135 and takes on Vasily Lomachenko in his first non-George Kambosos title defense. Now, people can say that, it was Lomachenko won, I scored it for Lomachenko. You know what? That's what happens when you have 2 high-level guys in the ring. A lot of times you get close fights that come out of it. So even if you scored the fight for Vasily Lomachenko, like a lot of people did, you can't say that it was any kind of robbery because, one judge had it 115, 113 one way, and another judge had it 115, 113 the other way. Just, that's not a robbery. So I give Haney credit for that win. And then in his next fight, his very first fight in his first weight class, he takes on a guy that I thought was the number 1 guy in that weight class. Regis Prograis, long-standing 140-pounder, title holder, has been put on an impressive run of his own since that loss to Josh Taylor. And not only does Haney win that fight, but he dominates. He wins all 12 rounds on the judges' scorecards, picks up a knockdown in the early rounds of that fight. That was a flawless performance by Devin Haney in his first fight at a new weight class against arguably the top guy at that weight class. So Lomachenko, Prograis, those 2 wins, I think, make a really strong case for Devin Haney.
Yeah, and I buy the logic. I think we talked about this on one of the recent ones. Like, to me, there's no shame in a close fight with Vasily Lomachenko. Like, he should not be docked for that at all. I think the fact that he took that fight and weathered it and then came back with a pretty transcendent performance that you described. He didn't just dominate that fight, he won every minute of it. Like, not even more granular than every round. And I think the difference for me is I'd put Terence's performance up with the best we've seen this decade. Now, it's still a little early into it. So I think that maybe there's a bit of a tipping point or emphasis there in regard to, like, I've put it a little higher than just the best fight of this year. It's the best fight I've seen in quite a while in person. But then you get into, like, why didn't he do another one? I think it was totally fair. So I buy your logic. I think they're both deserving.
So what about the third guy in this mix? And that's Naoya Inoue, who you'd have to wake up pretty early in the morning to watch his 2 fights live this year. His first fight back in the spring, he absolutely dominates Stephen Fulton in his first fight at 122 pounds. That was the second most impressive win of 2023. The first being Bud Crawford. The second most impressive was Inoue over Fulton. He follows that up December 26th, knocks out Marlon Tapales to become the undisputed champion at 122 pounds. For the second time in as many years, Inoue is undisputed at 122, and he ran through the best in that weight class in 2 fights. I can't overstate this. That win over Fulton was incredibly impressive. Fulton was unquestionably, in my mind, the number 1 guy at 122, and he had no shot in that fight. He was beaten pillar to post, knocked down, eventually knocked out. And then even though the Tapales fight didn't go probably quite as well as Inoue would have liked, got touched up a little bit in that fight, especially in the middle rounds, Inoue eventually knocks out Tapales. Whoever gets in the ring with this guy, regardless of weight class, more likely than not, they're getting knocked out, and every time they're getting hurt. So I think you can make a pretty strong case that Inoue is the fighter of the year too.
Yeah, absolutely. And, last week after we did this, you told me to go back and watch the Fulton fight. And I did go back and watch it, and it was incredible. In some ways, I think it's almost unfair to Inoue that, he fights mostly in Japan, and his brilliance is not truly recognized the way I think it should be in the United States. That performance alone was enough to look at him and say, this guy could be the top pound-for-pound guy. Who might he want to fight? We talked about that last week. I just think there's a lot to love about him. And I guess this brings it back for me to what you started with. If any of those guys win any of the Fighter of the Year awards, that are distributed by various outlets and media members and boxing entities, I think it's really hard to argue that somebody got robbed. Now, because it's boxing, I'm sure there will be arguments and debate about it. But I think all 3 guys could win. And, the more we talk, the more I wish we could just split it up between them.
Yeah, you also can't, diminish the performances of David Benavidez, who had 2 quality wins, Caleb Plant and Demetrius Andrade. Gervonta Davis starts the year knocking out Hector Garcia, knocks out Ryan Garcia. He had a terrific first half of 2023. So a lot of deserving candidates. What I think it's going to come down to, though, is do you believe that Bud Crawford's 1 win over Errol Spence was enough to award him the fighter of the year? If you do, it's Bud Crawford hands down. If you don't, I think you're choosing between Haney and Inoue, which is about as tough a choice as you're going to get. Greg, good stuff, man. Do it again next week.